Safia Usmani, and this is Fulbright Women Podcast Season 2. We're excited to bring to you 20 brilliant women who are pushing the boundaries in their fields, in their lives, and serving as inspirations to so many around them. Joining us today is Hira Jaleel. Hira got her master's in animal law from Lewis and Clark Law School in 2020. As the first lawyer in Pakistan to have done a dedicated LL.M in animal law, Hira is currently trying to establish the field of animal law in the country. She has been litigating cases in court to protect animals, working with NGOs and government to update animal protection laws, and this semester, she's also teaching Pakistan's first ever animal law course at LL.M. Well, thank you so much. Finally, we're able to do this today after, I think, a couple of rearrangements of our schedules, but I'm glad we're doing it today. 2020, and correct me if I'm wrong, 2020 was when the Islamabad High Court ruled that, animals in Pakistan will have, will have legal rights, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't it almost sound comical that it took us this long to actually acknowledge that there are animal rights?
Actually, no, because it might seem as if other jurisdictions, other countries are well ahead of us in terms of the rights that they afford animals, except that's really not the case. It's one of the things actually in animal law that it's quite the seminal debate in animal law whether animals should have rights to begin with, because if you say, okay, animals have rights, what do you mean by that? Because the term rights means something very different in a human context and might mean something entirely different in the context of an animal. For instance, should an animal have the right to vote? Should they have a basic right of freedom of movement? How would we then keep pets if we suddenly declare that animals have the right to freedom of movement? So when we talk about rights for animals, we're generally talking about certain basic protections that animals should have, which protect their interests. So their basic interests, such as freedom from pain and suffering, freedom from being tortured, freedom from being unnecessarily killed. So even the right to life, for instance, which Islamabad High Court declared that animals have in the judgment that you're talking about. Where that doesn't mean that we can't now kill animals for food, or we can't kill animals that are pests, right? That it's a very kind of qualified right to life, which is very different from a human being's right to life. So it was quite like this Islamabad High Court judgment was actually quite seminal and quite celebrated across the international community because it is such a progressive judgment. And it's actually like ahead of its time, I would say.
Could you just talk about that, like in comparison? Now we're really talking about, progressive in comparison to maybe some other countries, right? Could you talk about how many countries have actually taken this route of giving, legally acknowledging that there are whatever category of rights we're talking about here for animals, but there are certain rights that can be, prescribed to them?
So it's a little, so I'd like to draw a distinction here between, say, statutory rights that we give animals through the law. So to say animals don't have any rights under the law, I think would be a fallacy also, because when we enact, for instance, anti-cruelty laws that have been around since, say, the 1800s, and kind of the first anti-cruelty law kind of originated from the UK, and then kind of spread, and even our, for instance, anti-cruelty law, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act in Pakistan is from 1890. So it's a colonial era law. So those laws, what they say is that, okay, you can't, for instance, cause unnecessary pain and suffering to an animal, or you can't mutilate an animal. And so I think inherent there is the recognition that animals do have certain interests that we need to protect. Anti-cruelty laws were initially enacted to protect our interests in animals as our property. But over time, they have kind of evolved to being laws that kind of protect certain interests that the law recognizes animals have because they're sentient beings, because they are not inanimate objects. They're not the same as my car, for instance, right? My dog and my car are different because my dog feels pain and suffering, and so needs to be protected from feeling unnecessary pain and suffering. But in terms of rights, as in rights that put animals on somewhat of a similar, I wouldn't say similar status as human beings, but would declare them a legal person, which would give them certain additional rights, such as the right to sue in court. A few countries, in fact, have done that. So India, for instance, has a couple of judgments that have declared all kind of animals and living beings and rivers legal persons, with all of the rights that come with that. We have Argentina and Colombia, I believe, that have declared orangutans legal persons for the purposes of moving them to sanctuaries. And so we do have other countries that have kind of gone beyond that basic kind of statutory framework and have declared animals persons for the purposes of the law, which gives them additional rights.
Interesting. So, can you expand on the rights of animals in Pakistan that they legally have? Where do we stand right now, and what are you fighting for?
So right now, unfortunately, animals have kind of very bare-boned rights under Pakistani law. The law I spoke about, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act 1890, is pretty much our only anti-cruelty existing, our main anti-cruelty legislation. And because it's from 1890, it was enacted in a certain context, in the context of like working animals, horses. And so while it does cover all domestic and captive animals, it doesn't really afford them a whole lot of protection. And also the fines are super outdated under that law. It was revised by the Federation in 2018 to upgrade the fines, but those fines were also upgraded to the extent of the Federation and not to the provinces. And so then we have this kind of regime that doesn't really protect animals all that much, especially when we're talking about domestic animals, when we're talking about farmed animals, or when we're talking about our cats and dogs and pets. When it comes to wild animals, our wildlife laws are potentially, so they do afford more protection in the sense that they specifically they specifically state that their goal is to protect wild animals. And then also, for instance, in the context of hunting, our wildlife laws place certain restrictions on hunting, for instance, that ostensibly you could read as protecting wild animals, but are actually just putting in place certain rules of ethical hunting, right? And then a lot of the recent wildlife laws that Balochistan and KP, for instance, have enacted, and Sindh as well, actually specifically state that cruelty to wild animals is kind of prohibited under those laws. So then for wild animals, I would argue we then have more protection, especially because if you read those laws in conjunction with, say, the judgments that have been coming out of the high courts, for instance, the Carmen judgment, and then a couple of other litigation that's happening in the area has also been mostly around captive wild animals. And so wild animals, I would argue, have considerably more protection, legal protection, than, say, other sorts of animals.
So there are two categories of animals that we're talking about now, right? Domestic animals and the wildlife. I want to stick to the domestic part first. I was reading somewhere that in a year, more than 50,000 dogs, are killed in Pakistan, and a lot of them are government-led, campaigns that happen. But not just that. Apart from that, there's a culture that we see of just hitting dogs with stones. Cats are considered paranormals. Donkeys are ridiculed. Monkeys are trained to dance in front of us and entertain us, right? And all these trainings as well require, they do require certain kind of abuse that happens to these animals, right? So the culture, it's so then it becomes really complicated, because if you're talking about law, I did read somewhere that it is illegal in Pakistan to have, let's just say, dog fights, right? Or any kind of animal fights, putting them to fight against each other. It is illegal, but still it doesn't stop people from going ahead and having those fights, right? Because there's some kind of performance of masculinity involved there or whatever. Can you talk about that?
We're talking about dog culling to start with, because that's what the question started with. Dog culling is actually something that a lot of activists have been actively taking up in Pakistan, and it's kind of become the hot issue just because of the sheer number of dogs involved. There's a public safety element to it. Stray bullets, have in the past, for instance, hit bystanders who have just been present in the area. People's pet dogs ingest poison that has been left out for strays. And so it has become an issue, and also because of just the way it's so barbaric, and it's carried out Housing societies would usually do it early hours of the morning. I know people who have witnessed it firsthand, right? Dog culling. I know children who have witnessed dog culling firsthand. And
I
so
saw it
it
when I
is,
was a kid. Yeah.
yeah, so it's quite an issue. So with respect to dog culling, I actually am involved in some litigation before the Lahore High Court, challenging this practice of dog culling as being, illegal, unconstitutional, because it doesn't find any, at least to the extent of Punjab, it doesn't find mandate in the law. And so when government authorities are carrying out a certain action, the first thing you need to ask is what law allows them to do this. And in the case of dog culling, the answer is there is no law that allows them to carry out dog culling, at least in the manner in which it's being carried out and the way it's being done, right? Because even if you assume, and in my petition we kind of illustrate that this assumption is also false, that all dogs are dangerous, or all dogs are carriers of disease, or this is the best way to control dog population. Even if you assume those things are true, there needs to be a structure or a process in place, which there really isn't right now. All you need to do is to get a dog culled is just pick up the phone, call your housing authority or call the local municipal corporation, and they'll just send a squad that will go out and shoot dogs. So that's a completely illegal practice that we're challenging through this petition, which is still pending before the Lahore High Court. But I think your larger point about it being a cultural issue, I think is spot on. And I think there are a few factors that kind of play into this. With dog fighting, beer baiting, these kind of activities, there's also this element of profit involved. So one of the things, and that I always like to think about is, so what are we just an evil society, or are there certain factors that are driving this animal abuse or this kind of behavior towards animals? And I think that, for instance, when people are fighting dogs or rooster fighting or beer baiting, they're placing bets, right? So they're placing bets on either one of the dogs or on the beer to defeat the dogs, and so in that sense, then they're making money off of this entire thing. And so that's why it's such a lucrative practice that goes on, underground, or even though it's illegal, it's not kind of, the law isn't enforced as much because there's people are making money off of it. Similarly, I think with dogs in particular, there's like also a religious element to it, where people think, that religion kind of, or Islam at least, to the extent of Islam, forbids them from keeping dogs as pets, or dogs are considered unclean. And so then the line between just an animal that's considered unclean versus an animal that's actively persecuted gets blurred. And so people think that, okay, just because this animal is considered unclean in religion, it's okay for me to kind of, abuse this animal, or beat them up, or, allow for their shooting, which, is really, if you really kind of dig into it, no religion actually kind of allows this kind of maltreatment towards animals. So it's a false notion, but so culturally embedded that, there's also that element. And there's also the fear of animals, because we as a society just aren't normalized. Keeping pets isn't super encouraged in our society generally. Children are not exposed, and in fact, the tales we tell our children, right? So as kids, a lot of times we'll be told that kind of a beast or an animal will attack us if we misbehave, or some version of that story. And so then there's that conditioned fear of, like, so many people I know in Pakistan are scared of cats. They're scared of dogs. And it's like a proper phobia. Like, I'm not even trying, like, I can't invalidate it because it's an actual phobia.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of just a result of childhood conditioning, because it's not normalized to be around animals, cats and dogs, and to spend time with them. And so I think a lot of kind of these factors, when you kind of look at them holistically, they kind of really play into. And just to kind of add on to that, the last thing is also just linking back to my last point, humane education is not a thing here. So to kind of teach children from the get-go in schools that animals are living beings, they feel pain and suffering, and it's not okay to mistreat them. I think that kind of element is missing. I was never taught that, like, in school as a kid. And while we're very fascinated with animals as kids, I think that entire concept of how do we treat them, we should treat them well, we should treat them with kindness and compassion, is kind of missing from our core curriculum, at least in Pakistan, even in the best of schools.
You're right. There is a lack of awareness. There is lack of education around animals' rights. We can come to next, just the existence of animals, right? There's such a huge lack of awareness around that. There's also, I feel like, a traumatized kind of a relationship, because I heard stories growing up, that a dog bit a kid, on the street. And it is a whole structure, right? People don't know how to be around animals, for example. Stray dogs, for example, stray dogs, obviously they're stray, they don't know how to be around humans, right? So, and then whatever happens in front of us. But the cultural thing that we're talking about, right, the reason I'm more interested in talking about this is because I can imagine that this whole culture and religious backdrop, when we bring that into the equation, it makes your job a little more complicated than it should be, right? We do see things like, you already brought religion into this perspective, right? Culture, we already talked about it. We also see how animals are just used in our daily communication to ridicule each other as well, right? Someone is going to call someone a donkey, meaning they're not smart enough, and someone is going to call someone a dog. That's almost like, a curse, so these things, how complex and complicated all of these things and layers make your work.
No, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And often we see that these kind of animals that we use in our vernacular to kind of insult other people, those animals are often the worst abused animals in our country as well. Donkeys, for instance. I don't know, like when the 2018 elections were happening, there were not just one, but I think a few instances, in fact, two instances that I distinctly remember when there was this donkey that someone kind of wrote a political party's name on, and then they just beat the donkey up. And the poor donkey didn't make it. He was ultimately rescued by an animal welfare organization, but he didn't make it. He didn't survive those injuries. And similarly, a dog was then also, I think this was also somewhere in KP, was then also someone tied a banner around a dog of like a political party's, flag, and then they shot the dog. And so, like, again, the idea there is that that animal is inherently kind of, it's insulting for a political party or for a human being to even be associated with those animals, because we don't consider that. And that also ties into a kind of very prominent theme of animal law, which is the idea of speciesism, right? So just like we have racism or gender or like sexism or classism, there's also this concept of speciesism, which is discriminating just on the basis of species membership.
Mm-hmm.
So saying that, like, we're not going to give these animals certain rights, or we're not going to protect these animals, or we think they're less than just because they're not us, just because they're not human beings. Even though if you really kind of dive deep into the thought exercise of why do we discriminate, fine, okay, certain animals like apes or elephants have shown to be, very smart. They have social bonds. They recognize, elephants have passed the mirror image test. They recognize themselves in the mirror. They can paint. They can draw. And so really, just because they're not communicating to us in the language that we understand, we assume that they are somehow less deserving than us of rights or protections. So I do definitely think that cultural aspect and the way we talk about certain animals definitely plays a role into how they're then treated by wider society. I think it's kind of very spot on.
Mm-hmm. And so the animals that we are talking about so far are the ones on the street that we see, right? Zoos are no different, really. Our zoos function in sordid conditions, right? And animals brought from, let's say, abroad are completely neglected, abused, isolated as well, right? What kind of laws can help us there?
So when it comes to zoos, and this is again something that I've been litigating in and working on, it's our wildlife protection laws, because animals kept in zoos are usually wild animals, unless you have like a petting zoo that has like, goats and rabbits and stuff. Usually it's wild animals, right, that keep zoos. And so wildlife laws actually do call for a certain minimum level of protection that wild animals, even captive wild animals, should be accorded. And unfortunately, so wildlife departments in that sense retain a lot of discretion to make rules or regulations that would enforce such protections or to prescribe minimum standards for zoos. So what usually happens is, in other parts of the world, is that for every kind of certain species of animal that you're keeping in a zoo, you're going to have minimum standards, which would dictate, okay, what's the size of the minimum, and these are the floor, right? So these are not like, okay, this is all you have to do, but at the bare minimum, this is the size of the lion's enclosure, this is the kind of food he has to be
Mm,
given. Prey animals don't have to be housed next to predator animals. Certain
mm,
animals like chimpanzees or bears or elephants are really intelligent. They're really
mm,
smart. And zoos are essentially like prisons, right? So
mm,
even for a human being, when you keep them locked up somewhere or when you keep them alone, why is solitary confinement considered the worst kind of punishment, right? Because we need enrichment, we need mental enrichment, we need social enrichment. And so for animals as well, or at least for certain kind of species, you need either need to house them with others of their own kind, or you need to provide them mentally stimulating activities, or they get depressed and they
mm,
show signs of like mental illness, which is
mm,
also like happened to a lot of animals. Like Kavan was exhibiting signs of it's called zoocosis when it happens in animals, like signs of mental illness because of being, alone and solitary and not having anything to do basically all day.
mm, mm,
And so zoos around the world are now starting to recognize that, okay, these animals are not just objects on display, they're actually living beings, and if we need to keep them in these conditions where they're essentially being kept captive, kept
yeah.
being imprisoned, then we need to provide them a minimum kind of standards. And I think while there's potential, the law certainly allows for such standards to be promulgated in Pakistan. I haven't so far seen any kind of province actually meaningfully creating those standards to protect animals, or to kind of say, okay, these are the bare minimum protections, or these are the bare minimum conditions in which certain species have to be kept. So there's a lot of potential there for improvement.
So where do I'm curious, where do zoos stand in your personal vision for animal rights?
I think it's like just worldwide and generally with like animal activists and even conservationists, the idea is that you need to phase zoos out now, because zoos are just this outdated. I mean, zoos were also once used to keep like human beings on
Yeah.
display. So,
Yeah.
they're just the entire idea was kind of very abhorrent to begin
Yeah.
with. And so the world, or just the general consensus now appears to be that move towards a sanctuary model, where
Mm,
animals can actually live out the rest of their lives in conditions that match their natural habitat as much as possible. Because I mean, there are competing arguments there, right? So one argument is that, okay, but actual natural habitats of a lot of these wild animals are now completely depleted or are on the verge of just being
mm,
extinguished,
mm,
because we have encroached upon their natural habitat to the extent where would these animals go? They would literally
go.
go extinct if we don't keep them, if we don't conserve them. So conservation is a big reason for people saying that we should still have zoos. And to that I say, oh, and like to that, I and many other people kind of also say that okay, but then you could also have a wildlife sanctuary, or you could have a national park or somewhere where, okay, those animals natural habitat, to the extent that you still preserve, but they don't have to live in a cage. They can still live their natural lives and express their species specific behavior as much as they possibly want to or can. And then the second is education, right? So that's like a big one, that how will our kids ever see an African elephant? They'll never get
Mm,
to go to Africa. And so our kids would, but then also the way, at least in Pakistan, I think that argument completely doesn't hold true, because if
mm,
you're taking a kid to a zoo in Pakistan, what are you teaching them? That animals belong in tiny cages, and that they don't and that it's okay to mistreat them or to tease them or to abuse them essentially. So I think
mm,
zoos in Pakistan only teach children the fact that animals don't have any worth or value, and it's okay to treat them as however you want to treat them. And I think that's the opposite of the education you want to be giving your children ideally, which is a kind of a more care, compassion and care ethic, right? And so I think zoos are definitely not achieving that purpose in Pakistan as well, and so they definitely should be shut down. That's my kind of opinion.
yeah. I kind of want to go back to your personal journey in terms of, you are the first, I think you're the first person in Pakistan who got a dedicated degree in animal law, right? Where did you get the inspiration to do that? Because there wasn't any around, right? So where did you get that from? And what has the reaction and reception been to you towards your degree?
So the inspiration, I think a lot of like really lucky things, like a lot of things happened in my life that just kind of, it was just luck that it all lined up and led me to animal law. So I got my dog Peanut in my last year of law school, and she was like my
That's
first.
a
I've
very
had
cute
pets.
name.
So yeah, so I had always had pets growing up, but they were like family pets, and not my own, and definitely not never a dog, right? So when I got Peanut and I started spending time with her and like living with her, then I was and growing attached to her, I realized that she's so similar in many ways. She's my friend, right? I can actually be friends with her because she understands what I'm saying. I can, communicate with her. She has moods. She's happy sometimes. She's sad sometimes. She clearly feels feelings. And she's also very sassy sometimes. And so I think that kind of really got me thinking more about, the way we assume animals to be and the way they actually are. And they have like these entire like inner lives and inner worlds that we, for some reason, just assume they don't. And combined with that, when I was in my last year of law school at LUMS, when I was taking like a moot court, one of my courses is called moot court, and the professor talked about animal law, and he was actually litigating a couple of cases in Pakistan for animals. And that also piqued my interest because I was already thinking about these things living with Peanut. And so I was just like, oh, wow, animal law, that's a thing. And then I actually joined that firm, which is also the firm I'm currently working at, as soon as I graduated. And I had the opportunity to work on those cases. And I think that's when, and around the same time, then I decided to apply for my Fulbright. And I think animal law then made the most sense because I was also like, where will I get to study this in Pakistan? Like, I would probably never. So if I can have the opportunity to kind of, get a scholarship and go actually study animal law as a field of academic interest, then, that's great. And so I applied for an LL.M specifically in animal law. And then I went to Lewis and Clark Law School, which is, again, the only kind of dedicated LL.M in animal law program right now that exists in the US. And the reaction has actually been quite, I think initially when people found out I was going for this degree, they were a little bit like, but what will you do with it? Because obviously it's so niche. It's not something that like as a lawyer, even I practice corporate and commercial law full time, civil law full time. So even animal law was just a bit like, people were just like, we're not sure what you're going to do with this degree. But I was just like, no, but I can at least explore it academically. And even if I just study it and do nothing else with it, that's still something that's worth it for me. But when I came back, actually, the reaction was just so good, because I think a lot of activists and a lot of people were kind of looking for lawyers to work on these issues, and to find, and when they heard that there's someone who has a dedicated LL.M in this field, I think they were quite encouraged by it. And since then, a bunch of like students have reached out to me, and I'm now teaching animal law as well. So I think that I've been really lucky in that sense that like I have gotten good reception towards like my degree and the work I'm doing in this field generally.
We'll definitely come to we'll definitely talk about your teaching experience in a bit, but before that, I kind of want you to touch upon any challenges specifically that you have faced in your journey so far that you'd like to highlight.
I think the biggest challenge, I think, would just be, again, the way people kind of view animals in general, and they just like don't think animals are as important. And again, I'm not never trying to argue that you should like put, and I think that's one of the questions I get a lot, right? Like, why don't you work for humans? Why don't you care about humans? And people just assume that if you are working for animals, or if you care about them, you don't care about human beings. You're like some kind of, you hate all human beings. And that's really not true. And one of the arguments, in fact, that I make in, some of my cases is also that, animals are actually the most overlooked segments of your society. So if the state, or if the society is even looking to protect animals who they don't have voting rights, there's no kind of, you're not getting much out of protecting them. And if you're still safeguarding their interests, then that kind of reflects on you as a society, that you actually care enough to actually meaningfully enforce protections for human beings as well. So I think that it takes like, so I think that idea of people thinking that you're somehow callous or careless or very privileged to care about animals and not care about human beings, I think that has been challenging. And I think for me internally, that's been a challenge as well. Especially in Pakistan, where you encounter a lot of poverty, and you encounter a lot of people who like, yeah, I am very privileged, right? And so then I do kind of struggle with that as well. That because I'm focusing on animals, is that just a result of my privilege? Should I actually be focusing more on like, other aspects and, other causes? And so I think that internal struggle, as well as kind of the accusations you get from people, have been a challenge. But I wouldn't say they've been an insurmountable challenge, but like, yeah, they do get to you sometimes.
I'm interested in that internal dialogue that you have. How do you deal with it then?
Honestly, it's not that hard, because just because of the sheer amount of abuse that you see every day, and honestly, it gets a lot. So, like, it's actually very traumatic to read about and to see the kinds of things animals in Pakistan are going through every single day. If you follow the work of some of the organizations like ACF Animal Rescue or Dogs Welfare Society, like um, dogs are having like acid thrown on them, puppies are being discarded in trash. Donkeys, I think donkeys are one of those animals that kind of perfectly reflect how the intersection of, class and, just animal suffering, because donkeys are usually used in brick kilns, or you are used as working animals by people who themselves are living below the poverty line. And so those people's interests are inherently kind of tied into the welfare of their donkeys, because the donkeys are essentially, they're a big means of their livelihood,
Yeah.
right? And so there are lots of great organizations that are working in this field specifically for both the welfare of donkey owners, as well as donkeys themselves, because the healthier the donkey, the happier the donkey, the more use the owner can even get out of the donkey and kind
Yeah.
of benefit their own family and, their own
Yeah.
livelihood. And so I don't, so like kind of looking at it holistically, I do think animal welfare is tied into human welfare. There's also been lots of studies that show that animal abuse is a good indicator of criminal behavior in adulthood. So a lot of children who abuse animals, it's also reflective of abuse the child might be facing at home. If a child is abusing animals, where did they learn that? They might be modeling abuse that they're experiencing at home. And so I think there's a lot of work again to be done in this area. And I think it's inaccurate to think of the two as being exclusive, that animal welfare is just for animals and human welfare is a completely, like, they're definitely very interlinked.
They are. Yes.
Sexism and animal welfare, like I can teach a whole like class about this, like the theories of how kind of the patriarchy reinforces oppression of women as well as animals,
Yeah.
and how they're kind of tied together. So yeah, that's how I deal with it. That no, it's not just that I'm caring about animals and ignoring all human beings. It's actually working for one is also working for the other.
That's correct. Besides, like, look at our society. We are a very, a large part of our society is pretty underprivileged, right? So there are all these frustrations and traumas and suppressed traumas that then are reflected and projected onto animals, because if you don't have power, who do you have power over, right? Whoever you have power over. And if you are in a hierarchy somewhere and you're getting like just not really getting the true value that you want out of your life and the kind of respect you think you deserve, then you're going to look into whoever is underneath you on the hierarchy, so that kind of project that, right? So it's a cycle of trauma, of violence, and it has to be there has to be solution. That I guess what I'm saying is there's no simple solution, so it's going to take its own time, which brings me to your teaching experience. How did you get into teaching?
I just pitched a course on animal law at LUMS, and I was honestly quite surprised that they were interested. Just because, again, like, so I guess it's also been a challenge, just or maybe this is more like an internal challenge, just assuming at this point, and I just assume people just won't be interested in animal law, or would just think it's too niche to really care about. And I'm more often than not find myself surprised that that's not the case. And so I pitched this course to LUMS, and like, to my surprise and obviously to their credit, they were immediately interested. And so I interviewed with them, and then so yeah, that's like, I wish there was like a more exciting story behind this, but there really wasn't. Like, they were pretty interested in offering the course.
No, but the story in itself sounds pretty exciting. Help me understand, are there any other institutions that are teaching this course similar to this?
No, I think animal law is being taught for the first time in Pakistan. There are, for instance, like veterinary schools do offer like animal ethics courses as part of like veterinary training. But this is animal law specifically, so it's like the intersection of the law with how it treats animals. So animal law is being taught for the first time.
That's perfect. There's always a first time, right? So onwards and upwards from here. Thank you so much, Hira, for taking out time to, talk to me in this episode today. There was so much to learn. And all the best with what you're doing because it's very important work.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to chat with you.
Of course, you have a good day ahead. Bye bye.